Pacific, here on C-SPAN. Earlier today, National Security Advisor Sandy Berger talked about the administration's foreign policy accomplishments at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. His remarks, including a question and answer session, are an hour long.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Press Club for our first National Press Club luncheon of the year 2000. My name is Larry Lippman. I'm the Washington Bureau Chief of the Palm Beach Post and the Cox Newspapers Bureau and President of the National Press Club. I would like to welcome club members and guests in the audience today, as well as those of you watching on C-SPAN or listening to this program on National Public Radio. Before introducing our head table, I would like to remind our members of some upcoming speakers. On Tuesday, January 11th, we'll hear from Nick Brooks, Chairman and CEO of Brown & Williamson Tobacco Corporation. On Wednesday, January 12th, Bernard Ebbers, CEO, MCI Worldwide Com, will discuss competition in the telecommunications market. And on Friday, January 14th, Bob Woodward of the Washington Post will discuss investigative reporting. Press Club members may access transcripts and audio files of our luncheon speakers at our website, npc.press.org. Non-members may purchase audio and videotapes by calling 1-888-343-1940. If you have questions for our speaker, please write them at the cards provided at your table. Pass them up to me, and I will ask as many as time permits. I would now like to introduce our head table guests and ask them to stand briefly when their names are called. All of the head table guests, except those invited by the speaker, are members of the National Press Club. Please hold your applause until all of the head table guests have been introduced. From your right, Jonathan Landay, National Security Correspondent, Knight Ridder. William Royce, Voice of America. Robin Mazzoli, Bloomberg. David Story, National Security Correspondent, Reuters. Dilshad Fakhrudin, Muslim Magazine. David Levy, spokesman for the National Security Council and guest of our speaker. Ken Esky, Chairman of the National Press Club Speakers Committee. Skipping our speaker for a moment, Francis Hardin, documentary filmmaker and member of the Speakers Committee responsible for organizing today's luncheon. Nancy Dunn, Financial Times of London. Morgan Olofsson, Bureau Chief, Swedish TV. Rick Christie, Cox Newspapers Washington Bureau. Nitzan Horowitz, Haaretz of Israel. And Bill McAllister, the Denver Post. Our speaker today is one of the most important people in what is sometimes called one of the most important cities in the world. He is a notorious hard worker in a city of workaholics. If others put in 12 hours a day, he puts in 14. And he's often found working in his office on 3-day weekends, catching up on reading. He is also an avid baseball fan who cheered for the old Brooklyn Dodgers and now is loyal to the Orioles. A graduate of Cornell University and Harvard Law School, our guest has practiced law, but he's always been drawn to politics. He was a legislative aide to Congressman Joseph Resnick of New York and later worked on the McGovern campaign. He opposed the war in Vietnam, but he didn't burn his draft card. During the Carter administration, he was on the policy planning staff of the State Department. When Jimmy Carter lost his re-election bid, our guest speaker returned to a law firm of Hogan and Hartson, where his specialty was international trade. During the first Clinton campaign, he was a senior foreign policy advisor, and now in the second administration, he is the national security advisor. His staff tells us he recently lost some 40 pounds. But even trimmed down, his achievements make him a big man. Ladies and gentlemen, let's have a warm National Press Club welcome for the National Security Advisor, Samuel Berger.
I'll have to screen what my staff says about me. NBC President Larry Lippman, Ken Esky, Chairman of the Speakers Committee, thank you for having me today. This is an historic milestone for me. It's my first chance in years to give a speech without alluding to the bridge to the next century or evoking the next millennium. We are in the next millennium, and I'm proud to be the first speaker at the press club of this millennium. I want to look back with you for a few minutes on some of the things that our administration did in foreign policy back in the 1900s and reflect on the challenges of an era that is already upon us. 1999 was a busy, intensive, and generally successful year for American foreign policy. Indeed, it's hard to imagine that it all happened in 1 year. A revitalized Middle East peace process, with the Y Accords being implemented, genuine engagement between Israel and Syria and the Palestinians on peace. The defeat of ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, with NATO united, Russia helping us to make and keep the peace, and Balkan integration into Europe now high on the international agenda. A WTO agreement with China, economic recovery in Asia, much aided by the strong U.S. economy and the President's commitment to keep our markets open. With the democratic transitions in Nigeria and Indonesia, the passage of more people to freedom in 1999 than in 1989, the year the Berlin Wall fell. Independence for East Timor after a quarter century of conflict. The peace process in Northern Ireland moving forward again. Talks resumed on the future of Cyprus. A Caspian pipeline agreement that can help assure our energy future and reinforce the independence of the new nations of Central Asia. An historic debt relief initiative for the poorest countries of the developing world. Imagine the questions that you would be asking me today had we made a different set of choices last year. You'd want to know how we could justify letting 1 million Kosovars spend the winter despairing in refugee camps. You might be asking how we could have let a regional economic downturn spark a global depression, or whether our failure to reach a WTO agreement with China would make that country more recalcitrant in the world, on the world stage, or what had happened to the idea of a comprehensive peace in the Holy Land. I'm pleased that I will not be getting those questions today. We had our share of disappointments last year, too, from CTBT to Seattle, but I am pleased with the progress we have made and satisfied that an active year in foreign policy has sparked a discussion about America's role in the world. One reason we are where we are today is that we, the Congress and the administration led by the President and Secretary Albright, generally have maintained a bipartisan consensus about the need for American leadership, despite the fact that for 5 of the last 7 years we've had divided government. Without that consensus, we could not have opened NATO to new democracies or approved aid to dismantle former Soviet weapons or approved NAFTA or created the WTO or ratified START II or given our armed forces the backing they need from the Balkans to the Persian Gulf. I think one reason why the protests in Seattle seem so unusual is that we've gotten used to having more consensus about our role in the world in this decade, or at least less contention than we had over the last 3 decades of the Cold War. But that doesn't mean that the consensus isn't threatened. And it doesn't mean that there aren't competing visions about America's role. Today, just about everyone believes we need a strong military to protect our interests in a world of continuing, albeit shifting, dangers. Unfortunately, some think that's about all we need and undervalue and underfund our efforts to prevent conflicts. All agree we need friends and allies when the going gets tough. Some seem to think that we can afford to alienate them when they need us to play our part in international institutions and arrangements. That way of looking at the world is reflected in the radical cuts to our foreign affairs budget Congress proposed last fall in the vote on the Test Ban Treaty, where a small group of senators forced a vote against the wishes of more than 60 of their colleagues in protectionist sentiments in both political parties. I have called that vision a new isolationism. It's one part go it alone and another part don't go at all. Now, of course, it's possible to agree that America must play an active role in the world, but still disagree about how. Every administration is tempted to deny that from time to time. Dean Acheson once sarcastically observed that the only way to run a country was to say politics stops at the seaboard, and anyone who denies that postulate is an SOB or a crook and not a true patriot. Now, if people swallow that, he went on, you're off to the races. The duty of internationalists in both parties is not to agree on every matter of policy, but to come together around the basic principle that Americans benefit when nations coalesce to deter aggression, to resolve conflicts, to open markets, to raise living standards, to prevent the spread of dangerous weapons, and to meet other dangers that no nation can meet alone. And that a key to forming and forging such coalitions is American leadership. That's what the Bipartisan Internationalist Center believes, and I'm gratified that as 1999 ended, it reclaimed center stage. The administration and Congress agreed on a budget that restored funding for our global priorities. We agreed finally to pay our UN dues and arrears, bolstering America's credibility as a global leader. Now, having advanced the argument that America should continue to lead, the beginning of a new century should cause us to reflect on the larger purposes of that leadership. For we are experiencing something more than just a changing of digits on the calendar. This period in history has been a genuine changing of the times, a time of collapsing empires, expanding freedoms, eroding barriers, and emerging threats. The success of our foreign policy in this new era is going to depend on our ability to help answer a few fundamental, long-term questions. One critical question for the next generation and beyond is whether our former adversaries, Russia and China, will emerge as stable, prosperous, democratic partners of the United States. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union 9 years ago, our engagement with a democratic Russia has produced concrete results. The dismantlement of 5,000 former Soviet nuclear weapons, the withdrawal of Russian troops from the Baltics, Russia's role in ending the conflict in Kosovo on acceptable terms, and the cooperation of our troops in keeping the peace in Bosnia and Kosovo. Russia itself is still struggling with the demons that have bedeviled it for years, the legacy of totalitarianism, poverty, corruption, conflict in the Caucasus. But the way President Yeltsin left office last week reflected just how much has changed. For the first time in their 1,000-year history, the Russian people now know that leaders can voluntarily transfer power under constitutional rules instead of holding on till death or being forced from office. Just as important, their new government has promised to uphold basic liberties and Russia's break with communism, and to hold free and fair presidential elections. The world will be looking with great interest as the Russian government moves forward to meet those pledges. Acting President Putin enjoys strong support from the Russian people and a newly elected Duma. Now, there's no guarantee of progress on the issues that matter to us most, but we certainly intend to seek it, including further reductions in strategic weapons as we work to develop a national missile defense system while preserving an anti-ballistic missile treaty. Whoever is elected Russia's next president will also inherit a tough challenge: to give Russians the sense of stability they crave after years of wrenching change and the hope that their sacrifices will be rewarded. The question is whether stability and hope will be based on strengthening or weakening the rule of law in Russia. That question applies to Chechnya as well. We've made clear that Russia's struggle against terrorism is appropriate, but its use of indiscriminate force is wrong. And it is inviting far more serious problems for itself than it can possibly be solving. But we should not stop supporting those forces in Russia that are trying to strengthen the rule of law and build faith in democratic institutions. Russia is paying a price for its conduct in Chechnya. Russian democracy must not. As for China, a sense of realism cautions us to be prepared for the possibility that this emerging power emerges as a threat. We should not presuppose that outcome or make it more likely by acting as if it has already happened. Realism tells us to see China in all its complexity, as a country that has lifted hundreds of millions of its citizens from poverty and expanded personal freedoms, but whose progress is held back by resistance to political reform that is vital to its growth and stability. We can protect our security and promote the right kind of change in China by continuing a policy of principled, purposeful engagement with China's leaders and its people. That is reflected in the deal that we have reached last fall to bring China into the World Trading Organization. It is a good agreement. Our markets are already open to China's goods and services. This agreement gains us better access to China's market in every sector, from agriculture to telecommunications to automobiles. But this agreement is in our interest even apart from its economic benefits. There is simply no better way right now to encourage China to choose deeper economic reform and respect for rule of law, to choose to play by the international rules instead of defying them, to choose integration with the world instead of self-isolation. The only people who could possibly gain from China remaining outside the WTO are the most backward-looking, anti-democratic elements in China itself. And that's why I'm confident that when the debate is over and the votes are counted, the Congress will support this agreement by establishing permanent normal trade relations with China. Now, a second question that will shape the character of the coming century is whether, as the first non-imperial great power in history, the United States can use our influence and strength to prevent, and if need be, to help end regional conflicts that threaten wider war. To that end, we have worked hard in the last 7 years to help complete the job of building an undivided, democratic, peaceful Europe, a Europe that embraces new democracies from the Balkans to the Baltics, a Europe that embraces Turkey as well as Greece. There's a great deal to do to advance this vision for the region, helping Kosovo through its first free elections while continuing to clamp down on violence, bolstering the democratic opposition in Serbia, promoting investment in the Balkans, encouraging progress in the Cyprus talks and greater cooperation between Greece and Turkey, helping more new democracies get ready for membership in NATO. Some of this will require money and steady support from our Congress over many years. But if we are persistent, the payoff will be huge. Not just a post-Cold War Europe, but a durably post-war Europe, where American soldiers never again are called upon to fight. We also have a chance now to help the people of the Middle East end 50 years of conflict that has threatened the peace of the world and isolated this region from the life of the world. Now, if you're hoping for an up-to-the-minute update on the Israeli-Syrian talks underway again this week in Shepherdstown, I will disappoint you by citing an old adage. When making peace in the Middle East, say nothing at all and you'll be misquoted only half the time. I guess that's an optimistic old adage. I will say for the first time in several years, the parties in the Syrian-Israeli negotiations and the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations have a common goal in sight and the common sense to see that there is an historic opportunity to achieve it now. The President, Secretary Albright, will spare neither time nor effort to help them succeed. Building peace in the Middle East and in Southeast Europe and elsewhere is a long-term challenge. In the meantime, America will sometimes be called on to decide what to do when brutal and dangerous conflicts break out in the world. And while we cannot and should not respond to every outbreak of violence and injustice around the world, neither can the United States afford never to respond. This is true because, as we have seen many times in this past century, big wars that harm our interests almost always start as small wars that the world does not care enough to do something about. It is also true that because in a globalized world, we see almost instantly the killing and uprooting of innocent men, women, and children thousands of miles away. In such a world, we cannot choose not to know. We can only choose not to act. Now, over the years, our administration has chosen to act where American interests and American values were at stake. For all the recent discussion of humanitarian intervention, we should remember that America hasn't used force for purely humanitarian ends since the commitment to end famine in Somalia in 1992. From Haiti to Iraq to Bosnia and Kosovo, we have acted both to help others and to protect ourselves from the consequences of unchecked conflict and violence. Now, I expect you will continue to ask hard and appropriate questions of the administration about when and how America should use force. But those who are examining this issue critically need to ask themselves some hard questions too. What precisely would they have done differently about Kosovo, Bosnia, Iraq, Haiti, East Timor? And why do they think that would have been more effective? How would they have dealt with the consequences of not acting? These are questions that come with, I think, the questioning of the appropriateness of America's engagement in those enterprises. Now, a third question we will face in the next century is whether terrorists and potentially hostile nations will acquire the means to undermine our defenses and cause us to live in fear once again. Thankfully, the New Year's Eve celebrations around the world passed without a terrorist attack. But just because we dodged a bullet doesn't mean there was no bullet to dodge. The last weeks of 1999 saw the largest U.S. counterterrorism operation in history. Terrorist cells were disrupted in 8 countries, and attacks were almost certainly prevented thanks to the good work of our law enforcement and intelligence agencies. But the threat remains real. We'll need to keep meeting this challenge, just as we met it last week, with both vigilance and a refusal to be intimidated. Part of the challenge will be to make it more difficult for weapons of mass destruction and the missiles that carry them to fall into the wrong hands. That requires the United States to do many things well at the same time, helping nations of the former Soviet Union secure weapons and their key components, continuing to prevent Iraq from threatening its neighbors, restraining North Korea's missile and nuclear programs and Iran's, aggressively pursuing terrorists and maintaining pressure against those who shelter them, including the Taliban in Afghanistan, strengthening global standards against proliferation. And yes, that means eventually finding the common ground on the test ban treaty that last year's truncated debate in the Senate prevented. We're also working to convince Russia that the missile defense system we are planning is not designed to undermine their deterrence, nor would it be capable of doing so. We must also convince some of our critics at home who say we should preemptively abandon the ABM treaty and arms control and move forward unilaterally. The difference between us is that we see defense against missile attack as part of a broader national security strategy. Some seem to think that missile defenses should be the sum total of America's national security strategy. We believe it is far wiser to move forward in a way that takes into account the technical feasibility of a missile defense system, its cost, the nature of the threat, and its impact on the overall security of the United States, including arms control. A fourth question looking forward is one that came into stark relief in Seattle. How can we shape globalization so that it spurs growth and lifts the poor as well as the rich, improves the dignity of labor, and strengthens protections on the environment? Now, in various ways, the protesters in Seattle were raising that question, but they offered a confusing answer. Many complained that the WTO is too powerful, yet argued, in effect, that the WTO should acquire new powers to impose and enforce labor and environmental standards around the world. All expressed solidarity with poor people in the developing world, yet it's hard to see how the 1.3 billion people in the world living on $1 a day will ever be able to live in dignity if we deny them the chance to sell the fruits of their labor and creativity beyond their borders. Certainly, there are practices such as forced labor and child labor that the world should not tolerate. But we must also understand that for the poorest countries, trade means growth, and growth means improved working conditions. We don't want a race to the bottom in the international economy, but neither do we want to keep the bottom down. It's not right. It's not in our interest. What we want is a steady march to the top that leaves no one behind. In the years ahead, we will face many other fundamental questions and challenges we can hardly foresee, whether tragedies or hopeful breakthroughs. But as a result of the last several years, we look at the distant horizon from higher and more hopeful ground. We have done much already to help shape the character of the 21st century and the terms of debate about America's involvement in it. Just think of it for a moment. The world's great powers will disagree on many things, but for the first time, they do not see one another as military adversaries. A decade after the Cold War ended, our alliances are not weaker, but stronger, with new, more enduring purposes. Half the world now enjoys democratic government, and the democracies that emerged with the end of the Cold War have survived and in many cases thrived. Bitter regional conflicts that once defied resolution are bending to international mediation. There is a growing recognition that war crimes and massive violations of human rights are the world's concern, even if they happen within sovereign borders. The central phenomenon of our time, globalization, plays to America's greatest strengths, to our creative and entrepreneurial spirit, and spreads our most cherished ideals of openness and freedom. Trade is more open today than ever, raising standards of living for many, though not all, and the world's economic architecture is being adapted to a new economy. People are thinking freshly about the relationship between promoting global growth and protecting the global environment. Perhaps most importantly, 8 years after Time magazine, echoed by countless other commentators, asked, quote, "Is the U.S. in an irreversible decline as the world's premier power?" Question mark, close quote. America has arrived at a moment when our strength and prosperity are unparalleled. That is a good place to begin a new era, and this is a good time for me to stop and take your questions. Thank you.
I have a tremendous number of questions here, and I hope we will get to as many as possible. Basically, what we're going to do is go around the world, and we'll hit a lot of stops. Obviously, with the Middle East talks underway now, there are a lot of questions about that. I realize you can't give us some specifics, but generally, what is the prospect for a peace agreement between Israel and Syria, and will it be possible without Israel giving back all of the Golan Heights?
Well, I think both parties see this as a historic opportunity. I think both parties are serious about making peace. And I think both parties have a sense of the urgency of the moment, that this time may not exist forever, that it may be a moment in time that must be seized. Now, having said all of that, one should not underestimate the degree of difficulty of what is involved here. These are very difficult issues that divide the parties. They have been at war 3 times since the 1940s. There are very strong views on both sides. Both Prime Minister Barak and President Assad, represented here by Foreign Minister Shara, are vigorous advocates of their national interest. And so I don't think one can predict the outcome except to say that I think that they are serious, and we are going to spare no effort to try to move the process forward.
How will the United States compensate Israel for the withdrawal of the Golan Heights? And specifically, will the President seek an aid package in the neighborhood of the $17 billion that has been mentioned in the Israeli press? Is that figure accurate? Do you rule that out? And will the United States seek support for Middle East aid at the upcoming G7 meeting?
Well, I think it has been the case in connection with the Camp David agreement between Egypt and Israel, brokered by President Carter in connection with the Y agreement that President Clinton and Secretary Albright shepherded through more than a year ago. That it is often the case that the United States has helped to share the risks of peace by providing support to one or more of the parties. And that's possible, again, in this situation if, in fact, there is an agreement. We have had only the most preliminary discussions with the Israelis about what they feel might be some of their security needs in the event of a peace agreement. I think it is premature to talk about what the elements of that, and certainly to talk about any numbers. We will obviously discuss that with the Israelis. We will consult very actively with the Congress before making a decision as to such a package and the nature of it.
But to be clear, this package would include money and military support. Is that correct?
Well, again, I think it's premature. I think that in the case of why we provided some assistance to Israel in connection with the costs of relocating the Israeli Defense Forces, in connection with security needs that arose in connection with that agreement. And I would assume that the Israelis believe that there will be some additional security needs they have in connection with a peace should it be reached. And I think we're prepared to discuss that with them, but it's again wildly premature, I think, to go beyond that.
Let's turn to Russia. What do you anticipate in the way of additional difficulties between the United States and Russia, or do you anticipate any difficulties in light of Mr. Putin becoming the acting president, and what is your assessment of him?
Well, let me take them in reverse order. We've had dealings with acting President Putin for some time, and are quite familiar with him. He has sort of two strands to his background. One, he was deputy mayor in St. Petersburg during a time in the early 90s when St. Petersburg was at the cutting edge of economic and political reform in Russia. He was very much part of that group of people who were strong advocates of reform. He also has spent 12 years in the Russian intelligence service, which is clearly one of the more insular vantage points on the world. We're pleased that since he has taken over, let me say first, I think it's important, as I said in my remarks, to recognize that the transfer of power here, Yeltsin's voluntarily turning power over to Putin, took place within a constitutional framework. This has never happened before in the history of Russia, 1,000 years. And I think that's an important fact. Putin, in his statements, has said that he intends to uphold the rights of the free press, free speech, freedom of conscience, private property. And we obviously will be very interested to see him do this. I think the real test for Mr. Putin, acting President Putin, will come in the next 3 months, when he will be both the custodian of Russian democracy and Russian constitutional, the Russian Constitution, at the same time that he will be a candidate for president within that system. And I think that the world will be watching very carefully to see whether he can do the second, be a candidate, while still upholding the constitutional democratic process of Russia. If he does that, if Russia passes power from its first democratically elected president to its second democratically elected president, I think that will be a good thing. Nelson Mandela has said that the most important election for a new democracy is not the first, but the second. And so I think we'll have to watch very carefully over the next 3 months.
What do you see as strategic threats to the United States in the in this century, and is Russia one of them?
Well, again, I'll flip it around. I think that the failure of Russia to succeed, Russia's failure, could present us, I believe, with a threat. That is, if Russia is not able to conclude this historic transformation, it is moving from an imperialist, for an empire, to a state. It is moving from an authoritarian government to a democracy. It is moving from a state, a centralized economy to a free market capitalist economy, and the third obviously has been the least successful. Those are enormous undertakings for a country to do simultaneously. If it succeeds, I believe that our future will be much better. If it fails, and it reverts back to a more nationalistic direction, or a more threatening posture, or a more hardline posture, it could, under those circumstances, reemerge as a threat, which means that we have a stake in Russia's success, just as we have a stake in China's success in a similar transition. I think in terms of the overall threats, I've suggested some in my remarks. I would say the failure of Russia and China to make this transition, to integrate themselves into the international economy. I think the terrorism and the new threats that are brought about by, in many ways, globalization, the ease with which terrorists can move, with which international drug cartels can operate. I think there's a whole new realm of threat we're going to be dealing with. The ability to take weapons of mass destruction across national borders with relative ease, the ability to attack our computers that run our infrastructure through cyber terrorism. I think these are some of the new threats that we're going to be dealing with, as well as many of the old.
Let's turn to Asia. How will you treat North Korea while they seem to be having intentions of developing the nuclear bomb and chemical weapons? And can you respond to the story today about China's transference of nuclear technology to North Korea? And again, you can flip the order.
Yeah. Well, with respect to the story today, the allegations in the story today, I can't respond to the allegations themselves. Although I don't want that to be taken in any way as confirming them. We obviously would not want to see China aiding North Korea's missile program. We've made that clear to China. I don't think it's in China's interest to have a North Korea that possesses nuclear weapons and the missile capacity to deliver them long ranges, since China is fairly close to North Korea. Now, in terms of dealing with North Korea generally, in 1974, we reached an agreement with North Korea, which was an important step, but not by any means an ultimate step in controlling their nuclear missile program. We agreed to basically that they would freeze and stand down on the reprocessing of material to use as nuclear fuel, and they've done that, and we have international inspectors around those facilities, and so far they've complied with that. But we still have a problem of North Korea's missile program, and we have had discussions with the North Koreans. They have agreed to eventually to have higher level discussions and to a moratorium on missile tests during that period. And I think we want to pursue that very actively. I think North Korea has a choice. It can either pursue more normal relations with the United States and the international community and end its threatening nuclear and missile programs, or can continue with its threatening nuclear and missile programs and continue to be isolated and continue to be contained by the rest of the world. And that choice exists for the North Korean leadership. We're prepared to go down either path.
Just very quickly, you said that you're not confirming the story that was in the paper today. Are you denying it?
I think I'll leave it exactly where I said it.
Okay. It has been announced that Chinese General Qiyong will be visiting the United States sometime soon to resume U.S.-Chinese dialogue. If this is correct, would his visit be appropriate, given his role in the Tiananmen Square massacre and I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time reading this, his threat to blow up Los Angeles with a nuclear weapon?
Well, I don't think that's last part is accurate. But let me talk in general. I think that a resumption of a dialogue, military-to-military dialogue between the United States and China is a positive thing. We're not transferring sensitive technology to China. We're not giving them anything that could help them build their military. But I think it is useful for us to have a relationship with an institution in China that is an important institution, whether it is to be able to deal with them in a time of crisis, or whether it is to understand their doctrine better. Our doctrine is pretty transparent. Pick up any newspaper, or particularly any technical defense paper, and you have an awful lot of information about the way in which we think about use of force and use of weapons. The more access, the more we can open the window into the Chinese system and understand better, the better off we are. So I think it's generally constructive to have the dialogue. We're not in any way providing sensitive technology or information to them.
There have been reports that the United States has put Iraq on the back burner while pursuing a Middle East peace deal. Is there any truth to this?
No. Iraq cannot be on the back burner as long as Saddam Hussein is the head of Iraq. And the reason for that is this is a recidivist user of weapons of mass destruction. This is the only leader in the world who's gassed his own people, used chemical weapons in the war against Iran. We saw what he did in '91. We saw what he did to Kuwait. We've seen since that time his continuing effort to be a threat. And so we have to continue to be very vigilant and very proactive with respect to Iraq. And that means, number one, containing the threat, making sure that he is not a threat to his neighbors, because he knows that if he threatens his neighbors, we will use military force against him. And the fact is, over the last 9 years, although it has been at times annoying or costly, we have stopped him every time he has indicated that he would threaten his neighbors. And it means ultimately helping those and supporting those who seek a different kind of future and a different kind of regime in Iraq, and we are doing that as well. So I think one cannot diminish our effort on Iraq.
We have a lot of countries and a lot of continents to go. What is the U.S. view of Iran's future, particularly the military and religious power?
I told Larry I was waiting for the Antarctica question, and I'm ready for it. It's cold. What was the question?
Iran.
I think that there is clearly a struggle going on for the future of Iran. And while I don't know that we can influence it terribly much, we certainly have an interest in its outcome. There's no question that the 70% of Iranians who voted for this president were expressing a view that they wanted change. They wanted more control over their lives. They wanted a greater degree of freedom. And that's, I think, something that to be welcomed by the United States. At the same time, there are forces in Iran who continue to, I think, be threatening, who continue to be hostile to the United States, and who continue to support the use of terrorism, and continue to oppose a peace in the Middle East which would bring stability and economic opportunity to Israelis and Arabs and Palestinians alike. So I would say, that while I think our opportunity to influence the direction of the course in Iran is limited given the history, that we certainly welcome and encourage the process of re-examination and the impulse for change which is clearly manifest in the country.
What is the U.S. plan for integrating Africa into the global process of the new century?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think
Progress.
Yeah. The President made quite an extraordinary trip to Africa a little more than a year ago, and the longest trip any American president has ever made in Africa, and went, through a large. Obviously, it's a large continent. We went to a number of countries, and there are great. I think we tend to see Africa in the United States rather one-dimensionally. We see it conflict, we see famine, we see pictures of refugee camps, and all of that exists. There are terrible conflicts still in the Congo between Ethiopia and Eritrea and elsewhere. There are places like Sudan where 2 million people have died of hunger in the past 16 years because of the policies of the Sudanese government. At the same time, there are tremendous signs of life and vitality in Africa. Nigeria, the largest country in Africa, has just had a democratic election, has quite an impressive new president. South Africa making its transition to democracy. Countries like Uganda and others are clearly part of an African renaissance. Now, I think, number one, we have to integrate Africa into the global economy. One of the things the President proposed when he came back was an African trade initiative, which is now passed both houses of Congress. It is in a conference committee, and hopefully we'll get that this year, which will give preferential access to the U.S. market and therefore economic opportunity for Africans. Second, we have to support the peace process that are going on in these countries in Africa. Doesn't mean American troops necessarily. It means supporting the UN or supporting regional efforts to bring peace. Third, there is a terrible AIDS epidemic in southern Africa that is beginning to become really a threat to the security of many countries in Africa. The Security Council, the UN Security Council, which we chair this month, and under Ambassador Holbrooke will spend the entire month focused on Africa for the first time. We'll be discussing the AIDS problem, I believe, on Monday, and we need to bring more attention and more resources to solving that problem. That's just a quick answer to a harder question.
Latin American countries are expecting a move from the White House on fast track in order to expand free trade. Is that part of your goals in the year 2000, or will that have to wait for the next administration? Well,
the first priority in terms of trade legislation is to get the Caribbean Basin Initiative enacted. That also has passed both houses, also in conference committee, and would extend to the Caribbean and Central American countries who desperately need it, the same kind of benefits that exist largely under NAFTA. I think that we will be discussing with Congress when it comes back the issue of fast track. But I think before we head down that road again, we need to have, I think, some degree of confidence that there is a consensus that did not exist in the past to pass it. And we'll be testing that in our conversations when the Congress returns. Obviously, we also have China WTO on the agenda, which I think will be the first big trade item of the year.
I have three questions about Taiwan. We're running out of time, so let me hit them very quickly. Press reports say that President Clinton will increase arms sales to Taiwan in both quality and quantity before leaving office. Is there any truth in that? Can you talk about the upcoming presidential election in Taiwan? Does the United States have any concerns? And what about Taiwan and the WTO as far as joining?
Well, in terms of arms sales, there is a normal process whereby we have discussions with Taiwan. We make judgments with respect to defensive equipment that they may need. And that process will continue this year. I think the Taiwan elections really, obviously, is a matter for the people on Taiwan to resolve. And the third part of the question was? We favor Taiwan's accession to the WTO, and we would hope that with the accession of China, accession of Taiwan would also be possible. And now, I mean, we don't see ourselves the linkage between these two, but I think as a practical matter, they would presumably have to happen in reasonable proximity to one another.
A question on Japan. The governor of Okinawa was demanding a 15-year time limit to the military base there. Will the United States accept such a time limit?
Well, these discussions continue between our defense people and the government of Japan, and who in turn is engaging the government of Okinawa. This derives from the concerns of the people on Okinawa of the size of the footprint, so to speak, that we had on the island, and the disruptive nature of that to life on the island. We've made a lot of adjustments. We've shrunken the footprint. This involves now the question of relocating an air facility to another location. We've now agreed there's been an agreement to do that. Obviously, the terms of that, what the duration and what the precise terms will have to be worked out, but those discussions have been going on quite well.
Mr. Berger, I want to thank you for coming and speaking to us about the world. Unfortunately, we had a lot of places that we still didn't get to, including the South Pole. But I want to present you with a certificate of appreciation, suitable for framing, and the highly coveted National Press Club mug. I understand that's the real reason you came here. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Berger is on a very tight schedule. I would ask you to please remain in your seats when he leaves. I would like to thank you for coming today. I also like to thank National Press Club staff members Leanne Macklin, Emily Reed, Pat Nelson, Melanie Abdo-Dermont, and Howard Rothman for organizing today's lunch. Also thanks to the National Press Club Library for their research. We're adjourned. Thank you very much. Good job. I thought I was going to get to the last question after we ran out of time. I wanted to try to hit as many of the high points around the world as I could. We're going to get you another stiff. This is the last one. No. We'll take it and we'll replace it. Absolutely.